So we had 3 points of inquiry on the table. What was the thesis of Kwame Ture's address? What working definitions of Pan Africanism can you provide? And then what new understandings or deeper understandings of Pan Africanism were you able to acquire through the engagement of the text? Who would like to provide us with what was being discussed in your breakout rooms?
I could go.
Okay, thank
I'll
you.
go for number two.
Okay.
We thought that Pan-Africanism is a movement to unite all African ethnic groups, believing that Africa is the one and that all African people belong to the African nation, no matter the geographical location.
Phenomenal working definition of Pan Africanism, Christian. Thank you. I think that's really spot on. Anyone else want to add to what they think the thesis of the speech was, or any new understandings of Pan Africanism that they gained through the text? Sebastian, what did you guys talk about in your group?
For our group, well, for the definition, it's not as good as Christians, but it was like um, for the definition of Pan Africanism is we see everything or everyone from Africa as one, and like well, for my personal definition, I was thinking that well, it's more oh shoot, I'm getting a blank. I'm getting a brain fart. I'm sorry. Oh, it's everyone associated with Africa. They all have a common interest, whether it be political or culture group. Um, they usually don't want everyone to become one, and anything involving Africa, like whether it's a continent, they want to be theirs. They don't want any like colonists really taking over their land. They want to take it all. They want to take back what's theirs.
Absolutely. Okay. And I would situate that, Sebastian, within like the liberation of Africa and African people. So yeah, absolutely, I rock with you on that. Anyone else want to offer what was discussed in their breakout rooms? All right. So for sake of time, okay, go ahead, Alice. I'm sorry, please.
Yeah, I was in a group with Sebastian, and I was telling him that Pan-Africanism could also be a community.
You know, that's really good. I'd say because oftentimes people think of Pan Africanism as a variety of things, but community is not one of them. And to me, thinking about it as a community is really the work that Pan Africanism seeks to do, right? And if we could begin to relate to one another as a community, that would change the way that we interact with one another. Thank you, Cassandra.
Similar to what Alice said, like a deeper understanding that I got from this text was I feel that the author gave some insight about how to move forward. So what does the future look like for African people? And how does unity and community create greater power over imperialism?
Wow. It's kind of serendipitous, Cassandra, your musings on Pan Africanism. I don't know if I mentioned to y'all, but I'm preparing for my qualifying exams for my PhD. And so, what your qualifying exams are, you have three separate tests on three separate subject matters. So, I have pedagogy, cultural studies, and Africana studies are my three tests. And so, for each test, you have 30 books that you have to read through to be prepared for the test. So you have about 90 books total to prepare yourself for these exams. And so as I'm reading through my books, this past week I've been really reading on Pan Africanism, and the three texts that I engaged on Pan Africanism focus on the futurity of Africa. Right? Yeah, 90 books. Yes. So a fundamental component of Pan Africanism is looking at Africa's future. Now, it's kind of crazy because I don't think this is really articulated explicitly in the text that you all read, but Cassandra's picking up on this, right? Kwame is looking at Africa's future, and he's trying to get us to think about Africa's future, and he's trying to get us to think about Africa's future in a way that we are in control of Africa's future, right? So I think it's very astute for you to pick up on that. And then also another one of my like pet projects theoretically is this idea of Afrofuturism. And for me, and not a lot of people merge Pan-Africanism and Afrofuturism, but I do, right? And I think that when Pan-African scholars talk about the future of Africa, without using the language and the terminology, they're talking about Afrofuturism. So it's really dope to hear you pick up on that, Cassandra. Okay, so let me get into my notes. So this, which you guys read, is from this book here, Stokely Speaks, which is a collection of speeches by Stokely Carmichael, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, more recently referred to as Kwame Ture. But before I get too deep into the text, I want to kind of provide you guys with my personal relationship to Pan-Africanism. And I'm going to separate it within like 3 different compartments, if you will. So first, from a political, organizational, and practical standpoint, right? For about 7 to 10 years, I organized with this revolutionary organization called the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Now, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which I'll call the party just for not to, so I have to say that long ass word or long ass title, but the party is made up of 3 individuals. One of which being Kwame Ture, who we read, right? Kwame Nkrumah, who was the president of independent Ghana, and then Sekou Ture, right? So if you remember, I say Stokely Carmichael changed his name to Kwame Ture. And this is an homage to Kwame Nkrumah, where he takes his first name from, and Sekou Ture, where he takes his last name from to come up with this Kwame Ture. So Kwame Ture, through his organizing with SNCC, through his organizing with the Black Panther Party, he's forced out of the United States. And with him being forced out of the United States, he travels the world. He lands in Africa, in Guinea, where he meets Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Ture. The 3 of them come up with this organization, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and they task Kwame Ture with bringing that party back to the United States and organizing in the United States. The party looks at their means of organizing as developing what they call the revolutionary intelligentsia, right? So the intellectual body that will fortify the revolutionary movement, right? And so they identify college campuses as the spaces where you would find this revolutionary intelligentsia. Through a brother who is real connected in the LA community, he's an ancestor now, Didan Kamathi, he introduced me to the party. And while I was doing my undergrad at Cal State LA was the hub of revolutionary Pan-African thought in Southern California. The party defines Pan-Africanism as an objective. And the objective is the total liberation and unification of Africa and African people under scientific socialism, right? So this socialism becomes a fundamental component of Pan-Africanism because, as Nkrumah articulates, socialism is the antithesis to capitalism, right? And so all of the party's programming, all of the party's political education, all of the party's organizational efforts was to support their objective of Pan-Africanism. So on Cal State LA's campus, we have African Liberation Day annually for a good 5-year period. We would have a series of movie nights that would deal with revolutionary Pan-African films that we would show. I think it was like once a week we'd have a movie night. So again, Cal State LA was the hub of Pan-Africanist revolutionary thought during my tenure, during my undergrad at Cal State LA, right? So this is the political understanding that I have of Pan-Africanism as an objective, right? The other side is the theoretical side. I received my bachelor's in Pan-African Studies from Cal State LA. I received my master's in Pan-African Studies from Cal State LA. I'm currently doing my Ph.D. in Cultural Studies, but with a focus on African Studies, okay? My dissertation, so my overall culminating project for my PhD, is the development of a Pan-African pedagogy, right? So when you hear pedagogy, think of it as like a method of teaching, a teaching methodology, okay? So for me, I'm coming up with a methodology, a teaching practice that will be specified to African people throughout the diaspora. A lot of the way that I engage you within this course has been through this Pan-African pedagogy. In fact, my time with you allows me to practice the theory that I'm cultivating, if that makes sense, right? So that's the political, sorry, that what I gave you the political. This is the theoretical engagement with Pan-Africanism, and then in my personal life, right? I was born here in the United States of America. I consider myself an African in America, right? My wife, she is born also in the United States, but her parents migrated from Eritrea in East Africa next to Ethiopia, right? So her cultural understanding, her cultural background is African on the continent, right? So my children are very much brought up in a Pan-African home. They have a cultural influence from the continent, an Eritrean cultural influence, a Habesha cultural influence, and then they have the black cultural influence from my side of the family, right? Above my shoulder on my right-hand side, the red, black, and green is a Pan-African flag, right? So all the way that my household, my intellectual practice, and my political practice is very much informed by this notion of Pan-Africanism. And I bring this up to show you that, yes, Pan-Africanism is what's articulated in the pages of this book, which are theoretical, which are theory, right? But there's also very real implications in how Pan-Africanism can manifest itself in the material world, okay? So to jump into the text, Kwame provides us with his working definition of Pan-Africanism to open up the speech. He says, Pan-Africanism is grounded in the belief that Africa is one, the artificial borders being the result of the Berlin Conference, where European powers carved up the continent and divided the spoils among themselves. Pan-Africanism is grounded in the belief that all African peoples, wherever we may be, are one, and as Dr. Nkrumah says, belong to the African nation. Pay attention to this. Our dispersal, and this is where this dispersal is this idea of us being separated and broken up, right? Our dispersal was the result of European imperialism and racism. Our dispersal was the result of European imperialism and racism. Now, Kwame is like one of my favorite ancestors in the world. Kwame and Malcolm is like my two pillars, if you will, right? But I have to disagree with Kwame on this one. And here's why. To say that our dispersal was due to European imperialism, invasion, racism, colonialism, etc., to me steals the agency of African people. You've all sat through the whole semester of my class, so you know that African people made their first large-scale migration outside of Africa, tracing back 200,000 years ago, right? You guys sat through a semester of my class, so you all know that Abu Bakr II made his way to the Americas from Africa at least 2 centuries prior to Columbus, right? So for me, these historical facts symbolize the radix point, the starting point of our dispersal, right? And none of those facts that I just riddled off to you have anything to do with the presence of Europeans, okay? Jelani, go ahead.
Professor, do you think Kwame in late 60s was aware of that historical knowledge? Do you think some of that, those ancient historical facts had come out by the 60s, or was he just sort of working with what he had?
I think he was working with what he had, because, so for example, 2 of the sources that I'm quoting, The Destruction of Black Civilization was published in '93. They Came Before Columbus by Adam Van Sertima was also published in the '90s, and that would be after this speech that he gave. He has another speech on the cultural relevance of Africa, where he says that European invasion was an interruption into Pan-Africanism. So to answer your question, Jelani, I think this was given, I want to say 60 something. when he gave this speech, I don't know if books were published about those historical facts, right? But he does course correct in the late 90s, and he articulates European invasion as an interruption into the process of Pan-Africanism. So that's a very astute observation on your point. And that lets Kwame off the hook. But as I mentioned, like this whole week that we've been off, I've been just reading various Pan-African literature, and everyone articulates this starting point of Pan-Africanism like Kwame does, being European invasion, right? So for me, it was just like, man, we have to move beyond that, right? Because then listen to how he follows up, Kwame, that is. So, right, we know that he says that our dispersal was the result of European imperialism and racism. But then peep this. African history, so let me go back a little bit. Pan-Africanism, this is on page 222, the first sentence. Pan-Africanists study the history of African and her people. African history is rarely recorded as the history of Africans. It is usually reported as an offshoot of European history. Consequently, when we have studied our history, the starting point has usually been the discovery of Africans by the European. Thus, our brothers and sisters in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas and the Caribbean, began our history with slavery. And on the continent, we begin with colonialism. And these two facts are not joined, okay? So this is what he's saying. And he's even talking about Pan-Africanists, right? These are people who study Africa. He says they start their history with contact with Europeans, or the discovery is what he calls it, right? So because of this, folks, African people in the Western Hemisphere, their starting point is enslavement, right? African folks on the continent of Africa, their starting point is colonialism, right? And he says he's warning against this, right? He says this incorrect analysis makes for incorrect solutions. Got me? So the analysis of starting out African history with slavery or colonialism is incorrect, which would lead to incorrect solutions. This is what he's arguing, okay? But then what I find interesting is he does the same thing with Pan-Africanism, right? He says Pan-Africanism's starting point, Pan-African's history starts with European invasion, European racism, right? So for me, we have to move beyond that. I know that African people migrated outside of Africa prior to European even thinking about Africa, right? I know that Africa, anti-modernity Africa, ANTE, modernity Africa, was a nautical society. When I say a nautical society, is they use boats. They travel the ocean, right? Their vast knowledge of astrology allowed them to navigate the oceans, right? In fact, the knowledge of astrology that allowed them to navigate the oceans allowed them to migrate outside of the central point, being that Kemet and Kush area, and migrate south and migrate west, right? So I know African people are migratory people, right? So if that's the case, we're making movements regardless of what the European is doing. So at the point that we decided to move outside of Africa begins this idea of the diaspora, begins this idea of Pan-Africanism, okay? Then he makes the claim that all African resistance, be it subconscious or conscious, all resistance against European invasion is moving towards Pan-Africanism. Again, whether they knew it or not, is a step towards this notion or this idea of Pan-Africanism. He also claims that African intellectual giants have been baptized in this idea of of Pan-Africanism, excuse me. And he names off the giants, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, Henry Sylvester Williams, Joseph Casey Hayford, George Padmore, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, Patrice Lumumba, Malcolm X, Ben Bella, President Ahmed Sekou Ture, and President Kwame Nkrumah are the giants who've been baptized by Pan-Africanism. Then he goes through a phenomenal job of charting the victories, the ruptures, and the evolution of Pan Africanism, right? And he says, okay, at the first Pan African Congress, practically all of Africa was colonized. Thus, Pan Africanism remained on the level of theories and protestations. Today, with nominal independence on our continent, Pan Africanism finds fertile ground. When Casely Hayford was calling out to his brothers across the Atlantic, Ghana was the Gold Coast and Britain her master. So what he's saying is when Casey Hayford was in the Western Hemisphere advocating for Pan-Africanism and calling for Africans on the continent to clamor to also speak to this notion of Pan-Africanism, Ghana was colonized by Britain and it was called the Gold Coast, right? But peep the evolution. Then he says, when Kwame Nkrumah stretched out his hands to his brothers across the Atlantic, Ghana was independent and Nkrumah her leader, right? So you see the evolution of African and Pan-African thought. When Marcus Garvey said that unless Africa is free, Africans the world over would not be free, he was answered by a counter-revolutionary president, King of Liberia, who wanted no relations with his brothers, okay? So when Marcus Garvey, born in Jamaica, migrates to the Americas and starts the largest mass movement of black folks in the Western Hemisphere with his United Negro Improvement Association. And he's calling from Americas for a Pan-African movement and for repatriation back to Africa, right? The King of Liberia wanted nothing to do with that. Now, a historical tidbit about Liberia. During Reconstruction era, when America is trying to determine what will we do with these newly freed African individuals, part of the conversation was, let's send them back to Africa, right? Some of the newly freed Africans desired to go back to Africa. So money was raised, ships were afforded, and a contingent of Africans here in the Americas were shipped to Liberia with the auspice, with the premise of colonizing Liberia, right? So this is like this idea of neo-colonialism, right? So we'll have a black face come in and do the same thing that the white folks would do as far as extracting African resources, labor, and things of that nature, right? So what Kwame is saying, as Garvey is advocating for Pan-Africanism from the Americas to Africa, the King of Liberia saying, nah, fuck that shit, I want nothing to do with that, right? But check the evolution. But Brother Malcolm X addressed the organization of African unity, right? So Malcolm X, again, born in New York, right? Is able to travel across the Atlantic and address the Organization of African Unity, which is all the African heads of states, right? So again, an evolution in Pan-Africanism. Marcus Garvey never set foot on Africa, and Brother Malcolm was treated like a shining African prince. Africans of the diaspora have been moving at a rapid pace towards Pan-Africanism, but very few people have analyzed that movement correctly. Brother Malcolm told us we needed black nationalism. So think to the Ballad of the Bullet. But black nationalism is African nationalism because the black man is the African and the African is the black man. Thus, Brother Malcolm's black nationalism is really African nationalism. African nationalism finds its highest aspiration in Pan-Africanism, right? So what he's saying is all that Malcolm was advocating for in that speech, the Ballad of the Bullet, as he regards to, or as he refers to, or as he articulates as black nationalism, is really Pan-Africanism. Malcolm just hadn't developed the language and the lexicon to articulate that yet, right? And then on the next page, Kwame seeks to separate himself from his contemporaries. And he says that, you know, it's becoming very popular in Pan-Africanist thought to say that you do not have to repatriate back to Africa to be considered a Pan-Africanist, right? You don't have to move physically back to the continent. And he wants to challenge this notion, right? But he understands that not everyone may have the resources or the opportunity to relocate back to Africa. But he says Africa must be at the forefront of our consciousness. Africa must be at the forefront of our organizing efforts, right? when we talk about liberating and unifying African people, we must think about unifying and liberating the continent of Africa itself. As Malcolm X famously said, revolution is about land. And you cannot have a successful revolution without addressing the question of land. So Kwame is attentive to that and says we cannot foreclose this idea of African land. And then for me, he closes out the address with a realistic optimism and also a call to action. Now, and I'll read the final paragraph. The African for the last 500 years has known neither peace nor justice. His wealth and his labor have built Western Europe and America. When these forces are harnessed for our benefit, the reconstruction of Mother Africa will be worthy of her glorious past. The setback in Ghana is of no cause for dismay. So the setback in Ghana that he's mentioning, remember how I said in 1966, Kwame Nkrumah becomes, it might be 1965, 65 or 66, Nkrumah becomes the president of independent Ghana, okay? Within a 2 to 3 year period, Western powers are able to stage a successful coup d'etat and throw Nkrumah off the throne. To avoid murder and assassination, Nkrumah goes underground and he flees to Guinea. Guinea is the land that is liberated and ran by Sekou Ture. Sekou Ture gives Kwame Nkrumah refuge and makes Kwame Nkrumah the co-president of Guinea. So this is the minor setback that Kwame's talking about, right? And he says that Pan-Africanists know that setbacks are not new to the African struggle. This one has not even been long. And here comes the realistic optimism. We are not afraid of the inevitable bloodshed, for beyond it, we see victory in the air, right? So we know that some blood will be spilled, but we know that the spilling of that blood will ultimately lead to our victory. So those are my notes for the reading. We'll transition into our fishbowl. I do believe that the majority of you have fishbowled already, but I want to give the opportunity for those to fishbowl who have not gone twice already, because I believe after today we'll have one more opportunity. So Stephanie, we have you down. Is there anyone else that wants to volunteer for the fishbowl?
Yeah, I would like to volunteer.
Sebastian and Alejandro.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm okay with just having 3, but again, I want to emphasize, if you have not done your 2 fish bowls, now's the time to go, because at best, we'll have one more next week. So for this time around, unless no one else wants to volunteer, we'll have Stephanie, Sebastian, and Alejandro. Whoever wants to set it off, it's on you.
I'll go first.
Okay.
I just wanted to point out something from the text. It was on page 24. It said, Brother Malcolm told us we needed Black nationalism, but Black nationalism is African nationalism because a Black man is an African and the African is a Black man. Thus, Brother Malcolm's Black nationalism is really African nationalism. I couldn't understand that. It threw me off.
Okay. Can I ask you, Stephanie, after hearing my articulation of that, does it make a little sense, or are you still confused?
Well, yeah, a little bit more.
Okay. So essentially what he's saying is, right, like, and it's kind of what I'm saying too, in the sense that I don't consider myself an African American, right? I consider myself at best an African in America, right? So I would also consider myself a Black man, right? But I equate me being Black to me being African. There's no separation in the two. And this is what Kwame's saying. So when Malcolm is talking about in that speech, the Ballad of the Bullet, and he's advocating for this Black nationalism, what Kwame is saying, he's really talking about African nationalism. He's not just talking about Black folks within the Americas, he's talking about Black folks globally, right? Or African people throughout the world. So when Malcolm is saying Black nationalism, he really means African nationalism. Kwame is equating Black people with African people. He's equating them as one person. Does that make more sense, Stephanie?
Yeah. I was understanding it as like it meant 2 different things, but yeah, I understand.
Okay. Good question, though. It's a good question. Who's next?
I am.
Okay.
So my understanding of the book was, people were taking control over. One quote that I was able to pull from the readings is, "We are victims of imperialism, racism, and we are a landless people." That we are the victims of imperialism is a fact, many being victims of racism and imperialism as the other countries taking control and power over them by using military. Also talks about how Africa is divided into two groups. One group was taken into from the land for slavery, and second group had their land taken from them, also known as colonialism. Colonialism,
Colonialism.
and that's just about it.
Okay.
No, hold on. I still have something more. And they also talk about a few giants that baptized. As what would you describe it?
Baptized in Pan-Africanism?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one example was Malcolm X, and how they pledged their lives to end the suffering because they saw them in distress. So their mission was to restore Africa's dignity and its people of being worthy of honor and respect again.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Alejandro. Good call out. Sebastian?
For what I wanted to talk about was Kwame's thesis for the discussion earlier. Well, it's kind of a question. It's more like Kwame was talking about how to achieve Pan-Africanism objective, which is like to unify all African folks into one and basically reclaim Africa. He talks about in the text on page 225, he's saying the question now facing us is how to best achieve our objective. In order to launch a clear program, we must have land bases, we must have countries with leaders like President Nkrumah and President Ture willing to surrender their sovereignty to a larger African community. For our purposes, we can divide African states into three groups: progressive states, neo-colonist states, and European settler states. And at this time, we must consolidate our powers. So my question was, is this his thesis where he wants to, like his plan, if when they not retake, but like get Africa back in a way to like separate the countries in Africa in order to like regain their former power, quote unquote?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sebastian. And to me, that question lets me know you're doing some very close reading. But I'm gonna read it one more time. And I'm gonna read a little bit further where you left off. Okay. Um, for our purposes, we can divide Africa's states into three groups: progressive states, neocolonialist states, and European settler colonies. Okay. At this time, we must consolidate our power. Therefore, we must support the peoples and governments of those too few progressive states. These leaders, whose only surplus is scarcity, are fighting against overwhelming odds to bring their states into true scientific socialism. So what he's saying is Africa's already been divided into these three types of states, right? So we have the progressive states, states like Ghana, states like Guinea, states like the Congo under Patrice Lumumba, right? States like Guinea-Bissau under the leadership of Amilcar Cabral, right? Those are the progressive states. They're already advocating for a Pan-Africanism, right? Liberia under, Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, right? These are progressive states, okay? Neocolonialist states. So he puts Ghana under a neocolonialist state because remember I says Nkrumah gets thrown off the throne and they put a puppet regime leader in Ghana. So that would be considered one of the neocolonialist states. At the time, I believe Nigeria was a neocolonialist state, right? And then you have your European settler colonies. So think of at this time South Africa, right? A settler
Okay.
colony is when Europeans come in, set up shop, and just kind of take over that space.
Most of Southern Africa, right? Zimbabwe,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, absolutely.
Botswana even.
Yep. So really, that whole Southern Horn would be considered these European settler colonial states. So Kwame is saying that Africa is already divided into these three fragments. So what we must do to get Africa back, to Sebastian's point, is we must all support the progressive states. We must all consolidate the power with the progressive states. And that would allow us to put Africa back under the control of the Africans. Does that make a little bit more sense, Sebastian?
Yes.
Okay. What I do like about this fishbowl in particular is the two of you work through questions, and that's very good because again, questions that produce new research, questions that produce new papers, and I hear both of those type of questions in the questions that were posed by Stephanie and Sebastian. Any from the fishbowl? Is there anything else? All right.
No.
No? Okay. Thank you guys. Those are three of you guys did really well. So we'll open it up to overall group conversations about the readings for about 5 minutes or so before we choose our groups. Any general thoughts, questions, concerns? Also, we have the speech with Kwame Ture and H. Rap Brown, a little short Free Huey speech we could talk about as well. So we'll open it up to anybody who has questions, comments, or concerns.
Would you say that amongst Black activists, everyone feels like this kind of solidarity with Africa, or is there like more of a division?
There's definitely a division. And I'll speak from like our now, Serena. I think it may have been more consolidated back in this time that he gave the speech, but now neoliberalism has really done a good job of bifurcating our struggle, right? Especially around this question of reparations lately. There's this group called ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, right? And their whole premise is the only people who should receive reparations are the so-called descendants of slaves, which is bullshit because like how are you a descendant of slave when that's anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But things like that become divisive because now they don't want to tie themselves to Africa, right? And they don't want to consider themselves Africans. Even in our terminology, right, there's been conversations around moving from this notion of being African American to just being considered Americans, right? So I think that we've kind of stepped back in some regards in our identification with Africa. But then on the flip side, from a cultural standpoint, I see the identification with Africa really advancing greatly. And really you see that through music culture. This whole Afrobeat movement is really a Pan-Africanist movement that Africans all throughout the diaspora are kind of gravitating towards. So to give you a complicated answer to a complicated question is yes and no. I think on a conscious level, I want to say no, but on the subconscious level, from the aspect of culture, I would say yes. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. Have you been to Africa?
I haven't. As soon as I get this PhD, I'm on a flight. I just gotta.
Nice.
I need to go. Everybody's telling me you gotta go. I just haven't really had the chance to do so. Ultimately, though, I want to just relocate to Africa, move my whole family there. So that's like my ultimate goal.
Yeah, because I'm Indian and like I used to resent that people considered me Indian just based on the way I look. Like I thought like, no, I'm American. Like culturally, I'm totally American. But then when I went to India, like I felt like such a like greater bond with people in that part of the world.
Yeah, and then at this point in the world, like I don't even shit. I'm almost nervous to be considered an American the way that America's fucking up the world. Like I don't even know.
Sure, yeah, I get that. Me too.
I want a different passport. Shit, can I?
Especially when you're traveling, it's like I'm Canadian.
Yes, American. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Anyone else?
Let's see. Just one question about Hayford, Paisley Hayford, and a couple of those. Like I know they had different congresses. They had like one for the Portuguese colonies, one for the French colonies, and the British colonies. How did that kind of like link up, like, especially the Portuguese colonies that seem to be like behind the ball in terms of coming out of
Yeah.
colonialism?
Yeah, that's very astute too, man, Jelani. One thing about Portuguese colonialism, it was some of the most harshest and cruelest colonialism that there were. So when you think about Portuguese colonies, Brazil, very, they say outside of Africa, Brazil has the largest concentration of African people, right? But they were brutal. Like their form of colonization and their form of enslavement was brutal. In fact, Africans in Americas who were enslaved that had real problems and were not being broken by the plantation system would be shipped to Brazil, would be shipped to Jamaica because of the viciousness of their colonialism. So I think that would attribute to why they were a little bit behind the eight ball. They just didn't have like the flexibility and the liberties to organize themselves the way that a lot of the other colonies were able to do. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, and I know the brutality of Congo, King Leopold.
Yeah, Leopold, vicious. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that vastly impacted the way that they were able to organize. I think also what's interesting when you look at the congresses, how long it took for these Pan-African congresses and these Pan-African conferences to make it to Africa, right? It took Nkrumah liberating Ghana to be able to invite African heads of states to have a Pan-African Congress on the continent. And I think that's also due to the fact of the stronghold that Europe had on Africa, right? Like they had I believe the first Pan-African Congress was in London. They had one in France, right? They had one in everywhere except the actual continent. And that didn't take place until Nkrumah was able to liberate the African continent. Let's take one more question, comment, or concern, and we'll choose these groups for the project. We haven't heard from it. Go ahead, John.
I just, in terms of that speech, Stokely's speech, you know, he like Malcolm weaves in historical, talking about Vietnam and the Aztecs and the Native Americans, sort of just giving everybody these backgrounds, just in case they forgot, just what they're dealing with in terms of genocide by, white Europeans. So I thought that was very interesting. And of course, H-Rap's use of comedy, which was, over the top sometimes, but right on.
Yeah, no, H-Rap can be a little bit over the top. But yeah, it was almost like a stand-up skit, the way that H-Rap comes off. But again, I think what he does do is like, he humanizes the oppressor in the sense that, like, you got to think in the 60s, white power is something that is like viewed as untouchable, right? So to have these black men come up on stage and just talk shit and belittle, this power structure, it seems trivial, but you can't imagine like how liberating that must have been to hear something like that, right? Even something silly as calling him a honky or something like that is trivial to us, right? But the power that held in the 60s, where everyone's coming out of this paradigm of, turn the other cheek, nonviolent. To have some people up here saying like, yo, this is not how we rocking, and I'm gonna belittle you, and I'm gonna talk about burning your whole system down. To me, it had to do some type of psychological liberation to allow them to feel comfortable to achieve the physical liberation. All right, so do me a favor. On the bottom of your screen, you have the reaction button. It's a happy face with a plus on it. Under that reaction button, you can either raise your hand or you could give me a thumbs up. If you had listened to the 6 songs and you know what song you want, please give me a thumbs up or raise your hand. I'm going to ask you what song you want, and then that way we can start establishing our groups. If you have not listened to them and you're not sure, I don't know what to tell you because we do not have a lot of time, but you might just want to pick a song without listening to it, maybe based on who the author is or the artist is. Okay, so to start it off, Alice, what song would you like?
For Women by Nina Simone.
Good choice. For Women. Next we have Christian. What song would you like?
Face the World.
Okay, Nip, Face the World. Okay, Christian. Cassandra, what song would you like?
For Woman by Nina Simone.
Okay. So Cassandra, make sure you and Alice exchange information, okay?
Okay.
Jen Lin, what song would you like?
Mama by Kendrick Lamar.
Okay, Mama by K Dot. Nicole, what song would you like?
For Woman by Nina Simone.
Okay, so Nicole, make sure you get Cassandra and Alice's information. We'll have one more for four women. Okay. Stephanie, what song would you like?
Face the World.
Okay, Face the World. So make sure that you get who is that? Christian's number information. Heidi, what song would you like? Heidi Gomez, what song were you looking for? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So you'll be the last one for the Nina Simone for women. So make sure that you get Nicole, Cassandra, and Alice's information. Okay. Ashlyn, what song were you looking for?
Sorry, I went to the bathroom, so I kind of missed some stuff. Is the Kendrick Lamar one still?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
Mama by Kaida. I feel like I'm missing some people. Emily, what song were you looking for?
Can I get Face the World?
Okay, Face the World by Nip. Okay, so make sure that you get Christian's information and you get Stephanie's information. Jelani, what song were you looking for?
I'm gonna do the Rhapsody.
Okay.
Cut.
Good choice. So make sure that you get information with somebody else chose Rhapsody. Who was that? I'm sorry, y'all. Who else chose Rhapsody? Somebody else said Rhapsody. Am I correct?
I don't think I heard it.
Okay. So you're the first one for Rhapsody then. Serena, what song were you looking for?
I would also take the Kendrick Lamar song.
Okay. Okay, so make sure, Serena, you get Ashlyn's, Alice, I believe, hold on, Ashlyn, Jenlyn, and there's one more. I'm gonna read them all through when I get done, so bear with me. Yasmin, what song would you like? Okay, Rhapsody. So make sure that you and Jelani exchange information. Okay. So do me a favor, you guys. If your hand is up and you already went, put your hand down for me, so that way I know who has not went yet. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna read what I have so far. Okay, Sebastian, what song do you want?
Can I get the Kendrick Lamar one?
Okay, you'll be the last one for Kendrick Lamar. So make sure that you, Jen Lynn, Ashlyn, and Serena exchange information, okay? Andrew, what song were you looking for?
I'll take White Man's World.
Okay, Tupac. Okay, Monica. Rhapsody. Okay, so make sure that you get with Jelani and Yasmin. That will be your group. All right. So I'm gonna read what I have. If your name has not been called, please make sure that you get that get some information to me because we're running short on time in regards to preparing for the presentation. So Stephanie, we have Nipsey Hussle's Face the World. Sebastian, we have Kendrick Lamar's Mama. Alice, we have Nina Simone for Women. Christian, you have Nipsey Hussle's Face the World. So make sure that you partner with Stephanie. Cassandra, you have Nina Simone's for Women. So make sure you partner with Alice. Jin Lin, you have Kendrick Lamar's mama, so make sure that you partner with Sebastian. Um, Nicole, you have Nina Simone's For Women, so make sure that you partner with Cassandra and there's one more. Cassandra, okay. And then it's Cassandra and Alice. Heidi, you also have Nina Simone's For Women. So Nicole, Heidi, Alice, and Cassandra, that's one group. Ashlyn, you have Mama by Kendrick Lamar. So make sure that you partner with Jin Lin and Sebastian. Emily, you have Face the World by Nipsey Hussle. So make sure you partner with Stephanie and Christian. Jelana, you have Rhapsody, so make sure that you have Rhapsody. You're the first one. Serena, you're the last one with Kendrick Lamar, so make sure that you partner with Ashlyn, Jen Lin, and Sebastian. Okay. Yasmin, you have Rhapsody also, so make sure you partner with Jelani. Andrew, you have Tupac, White Man's World. And Monica, you have Rhapsody, so make sure you partner with Yasmin and Jelani. Is there anybody, Alejandro? I didn't call you. Is there a song that you could think of that's or an artist that you kind of are familiar with?
Yeah, can I take Tupac's White Man's World?
Perfect. So that way you and Andrew are a group together. It's my favorite Tupac song, so don't fuck that one up. All right. Okay. Everybody should be broken up into groups. Let me ask you all a question. Is there anybody in this class that's in group A? And please let me know.
I am.
Okay, so Miguel. What song did you choose, Miguel?
So we're just choosing a song. I think I'm behind, so I don't really know what we're doing.
Yeah, so you have your final project, right? So this will serve as your final, right? Choose a song that you want to do a presentation on. That song will determine what group you're in. So the songs that we have available, give me 1 second.
Yeah, I see them here, but
okay. So which song would you want to do your presentation on?
Tupac's White Man's World.
Okay. So you, Andrew, and actually you're in group A though, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I might have to do, let me bear with me 1 second. Let me see if there's a you're the only one in group A?
I'm not sure.
Is
I'm in
anybody
group
else?
A.
Who said that? I'm sorry.
Me, Heidi.
Heidi?
Uh-huh.
Heidi, you have Nina Simone. Okay. You know what? Okay, that's a trick. So one, group A didn't even meet on Monday. So would Miguel and Heidi, would you guys be okay on showing up Wednesday for your presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll keep you all in a group together. So Miguel, you're with Andrew and who else said Tupac? One other person. And Alejandro. Yeah, and Alejandro. So make sure you three exchange information. Far as the presentation, I don't care what you do, right? You can do a poem, you can do a podcast, you can make a song yourself. I've seen that done in the past. You can do a video presentation. How you do it does not matter to me. All I care about is that you have a thesis of the song, an analysis of the song, a contemporary analysis of the song, and you pose questions to your audience about the song. So the same 4 components that are in your journal, I want to see those manifested in your presentation in some form or fashion. Other than that, it's totally up to you on how you want to cultivate this project, okay? For our last week of class that we'll be discussing material, we're going to jump into some poems. Normally, I have a guest lecture for this section, but the person I typically have to the guest lecture, she just got hired at Columbia, so she won't be able to join us. But we'll read this poem here, A Black Love Supreme, and then I'll provide you another poem by Fred Moten, and I'll email that out to you all. Read those, we'll discuss briefly, and then the remainder of our semester will be dedicated to these presentations. So we'll meet next week, we'll discuss poems. The week after that, the whole day will be your presentations. Whatever group does not finish will come meet on the day of the final, and then we'll wrap up with the presentations.